The cold settled into the village long before nightfall. By dusk it had already crept through broken window frames and into the seams of clothing that had not been replaced in years. Families gathered in their front rooms without lighting lamps. Curtains, patched from flour sacks and old dresses, were drawn tight. No one said it aloud, but they all knew why the darkness was necessary. A lit window suggested confidence. Confidence invited inspection. In one narrow house near the edge of the village, Marta kept her 2 children seated at the kitchen table long after the thin soup had been scraped from their bowls. The boy's spoon rested in his hand, though there was nothing left to lift. The girl's feet swung above the floorboards, her shoes 2 sizes too small but still worn because there was nothing else. Marta listened more than she breathed. The war had trained her ears. She could separate wind from wheels, wood creaking from leather striking stone. Her husband had been taken east 3 winters earlier. Letters had stopped the previous year. The last one had repeated the same promises printed in newspapers and spoken through the wireless. Germany would endure, enemies would answer for what they had done, weakness would be punished. Even now, though the front had moved and rumors traveled in uneven waves, those phrases remained lodged in her thinking. If the British came, she had been told, they would not distinguish between soldier and civilian. They would remember bombings. They would remember loss. Revenge would not require investigation. The children had absorbed these lessons in fragments. They knew that uniforms meant authority and that authority did not ask before taking. At school, before it closed, they had practiced air raid drills and recited phrases about vigilance. Now they practiced silence. Marta had taught them how to move chairs without scraping and how to cough into blankets. Darkness was not preference. It was a calculation. Outside, the village lay in a suspended state. The German soldiers who had once filled the square had retreated days before. Their trucks left deep ruts in the thawing road. Some villagers had watched from attics as the column passed, unsure whether to feel relief or abandonment. In their wake came uncertainty. Who would arrive next? And how would they decide who deserved what? Rumors filled the space left by official voices. Someone said that in a neighboring town men had been lined against a wall for possessing party membership cards. Another said that women who had worked in offices were questioned for hours and taken away. No one knew which stories were true, but the details accumulated. A door forced open. A man dragged by his collar. Footsteps running up a staircase. That night the village was quieter than usual. Even the dogs seemed to sense the tension and did not bark. Then, faint at first, came the sound of an engine. It did not race. It did not hesitate. It moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Marta's son froze, spoon clattering against ceramic despite his effort to hold it still. The engine cut off somewhere near the square. Boots followed. Not many. 4, perhaps 5. The rhythm was distinct against cobblestones. They did not run. They did not shout. That somehow made the waiting worse. Marta pressed her hand against the table to steady herself. She tried to calculate what they might accuse her of. Her husband's service? Her brief work at the ration office? The small photograph of him still pinned behind a cupboard door? The footsteps stopped outside her house. The children looked at her, searching for instruction. She had none to give. She moved them behind her, though she understood that such gestures offered no real protection. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the wood. There was no crash. No splintering of hinges. Instead, the knock. From measured. 3 strikes spaced evenly apart. For a moment Marta did not understand the sound. It did not match the images she had rehearsed in her mind. She waited for the follow-up, the command to open, the threat, the blow of a rifle, but none came. Only silence, and then the same 3 measured knocks. The boy began to cry without sound, tears sliding down his face. Marta crossed the room and placed her hand on the latch. Her fingers trembled so badly she had to use both hands to lift it. When she opened the door, she did so slowly, expecting it to be pushed the rest of the way. It was not. A British soldier stood on the threshold, rifle slung but not raised. His uniform was damp at the cuffs. Mud clung to his boots. He looked young, younger than her husband had been when he left. Behind him stood another soldier and a man carrying a canvas bag marked with a red cross. The first soldier removed one glove before speaking. His German was hesitant but understandable. He asked how many people were in the house. Marta answered automatically, her voice thin. He did not step inside until she moved aside. The children stared at the men as if they were creatures from a story told to frighten them. The soldier's face was tired, unshaven. He glanced around the room not with suspicion but with something like assessment. His eyes paused on the empty bowls. "We are checking houses," he said carefully. "Any wounded? Any sickness?" Marta shook her head. The medic behind him leaned slightly to see past the doorway. His gaze fell on the girl's feet, red from cold. He asked a question the first soldier translated. Did they have enough blankets? The question unsettled Marta more than an accusation would have. Blankets were not the language of conquerors. She did not answer at first. The boy wiped his face with his sleeve, watching every movement. The soldier shifted his weight but did not advance further into the room. He did not search cupboards or demand papers. Instead, he reached into a pocket and withdrew a folded card printed in German and English. It explained, in formal language, that civilians were to remain in their homes, that reprisals against non-combatants were forbidden, that medical assistance was available upon request. Marta had read many official notices over the years. They were usually accompanied by warnings. This one contained none. She read it twice, certain she had missed a line. From the canvas bag, the medic produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to the first soldier, who extended it toward Marta. "For the children," he said. She hesitated. Every instinct warned her against accepting anything. Gifts could be recorded. They could be used as proof of cooperation. She imagined neighbors watching from behind curtains, making their own calculations. The soldier's arm remained outstretched. Not impatient. Simply waiting. Finally, she took the parcel. It was lighter than she expected. Inside, later, she would find biscuits and a small tin of condensed milk. At that moment, it felt heavier than the door she had opened. The soldier nodded once. He asked again about illness, then gestured toward the street. "We will return tomorrow," he said. "If there are questions." Questions. The word sounded foreign in this context. The artillery had moved on, but the sound of it lingered in the bodies of those who had listened all morning. Windows had rattled until the glass loosened in its frames. Crockery had trembled on shelves already half empty. By afternoon, the firing grew distant, then irregular, then gone. What replaced it was not relief but a quiet that felt provisional. In the cellar of a bakery near the village square, Friedrich sat with his back against a flour barrel that had not been full in months. He had been a railway mechanic before the war narrowed his world to shortages and instructions. His left hand was bandaged from a factory accident that would once have earned him time off. Now it earned him suspicion. He had not been sent to the front, but he had not been allowed to forget it either. Above him, the ovens were cold. His wife, Anna, had insisted they hide when the shelling began. Their daughter, Lise, sat between them, her coat pulled tight though the cellar air was thick and damp. Friedrich tried to measure the distance of the guns by memory, counting the seconds between flash and echo, but the pattern had become unpredictable. It was easier to assume that whatever was coming would arrive without warning. For years, he had been told what the British were. The wireless spoke of them as patient but ruthless, men who would reduce cities and then arrive to claim the ruins. Posters showed them as caricatures, faces exaggerated, hands reaching. The message had been consistent. Surrender would not protect civilians. It would expose them. He had repeated some of these phrases himself in the factory, partly from belief, partly from habit. When the German units withdrew that morning, they did so quickly. Trucks rattled over the square, engines straining. A young officer had shouted something about regrouping beyond the river. No one in the village asked questions. They had learned that questions rarely produced useful answers. Now the absence of uniforms unsettled Friedrich more than their presence had. Occupation, even harsh occupation, at least provided structure. There were rules, curfews, forms to fill. An empty street offered no guidance. By late afternoon, the sound of vehicles approached from the western road. Not fast. not in the scattered pattern of retreat. Friedrich felt the vibration through the stone floor before he heard the engines clearly. Anna's hand tightened on Lisa's shoulder. They did not speak. They waited. When the engine stopped, there was a pause long enough for Friedrich to consider whether they might pass through without stopping. Then boots met cobblestone. Measured steps. No shouting. He expected the first shot to come from somewhere unseen, a nervous exchange that would justify everything he had been warned about. Instead, there was nothing. No gunfire. No breaking glass. Only movement. From the cellar window, level with the street, he saw the lower halves of uniforms he did not recognize. Different cut. Different color. Mud at the hems. One pair of boots paused near the bakery door. Anna looked at him, her expression asking what he intended to do. He did not know. If he remained below, they might force the door and find them hiding. If he emerged, he might be taken immediately. The logic of survival had become circular. A knock sounded above them. Not tentative, but not violent. 3 steady raps. Lise flinched as if struck. Friedrich stood slowly, his injured hand throbbing. He climbed the narrow stairs, each step carrying the weight of expectation. At the top, he hesitated only a second before lifting the latch. A British soldier stood outside, rifle held low. His face was drawn with fatigue, not anger. Behind him, 2 others scanned the street with the practiced caution of men who had learned not to assume safety. One carried a satchel marked with a medical insignia. The soldier at the door spoke in careful German. He asked if anyone inside was armed. Friedrich shook his head. The answer was true. Their only weapon had been fear, and it offered little defense. Any wounded? The soldier asked. Friedrich hesitated. The bandage on his hand felt suddenly conspicuous. He raised it slightly, unsure whether to conceal or display it. The soldier's eyes followed the movement. Accident, Friedrich said. Factory. The soldier nodded, then glanced back toward the man with the satchel. The medic stepped forward without being invited, but not forcefully. He asked to see the injury. Friedrich extended his hand, expecting a rough inspection. Instead, the medic unwound the cloth with deliberate care. The wound had been cleaned poorly days earlier. Supplies had run out. The medic did not comment on the quality of the bandage. He cleaned the cut with solution from a small bottle. It stung sharply. Friedrich clenched his jaw but did not pull away. Fresh gauze replaced the stained strips. The process was efficient, almost routine. Anna and Lise had come up from the cellar and stood several steps behind. Lise stared at the unfamiliar uniforms, her face pale. She had been told that capture meant separation, that children might be taken as leverage. She stayed close to her mother's skirt, waiting for an order that did not come. The soldier at the door looked past Friedrich into the dim bakery. Empty shelves lined the walls. A few loaves, baked days earlier and hardened, sat under a cloth. He did not step inside uninvited. He asked how many lived there, wrote something in a small notebook, then explained that the village was under British control. Civilians were to remain in their homes. There would be no reprisals if no resistance was offered. The words sounded rehearsed but not insincere. Friedrich listened for the hidden condition, the clause that would turn reassurance into threat. It did not arrive. From a pocket, the soldier produced a folded paper with printed instructions in German. Friedrich recognized the format, official notice, formal language. He scanned it quickly. It spoke of order, medical assistance, and cooperation. It did not mention punishment. The medic finished securing the bandage and stepped back. He gave a brief nod, the kind exchanged between workers acknowledging a task completed. Friedrich felt a disorienting urge to thank him and was unsettled by it. Gratitude toward the enemy had not been part of his mental preparation. In the street, another British soldier was speaking to an elderly woman from the neighboring house. She gestured toward her roof, where tiles had shifted from the shelling. The soldier examined the damage, then pointed toward a truck where planks were stacked. There was no immediate promise, only assessment. The absence of aggression created its own strain. Friedrich had braced for humiliation, for raised voices and accusations. He had prepared to absorb it silently, believing that endurance would protect his family. Instead, he was confronted with procedure and restraint. It left him unsure how to behave. When the soldiers moved on to the next building, they did so without haste. Their boots echoed down the street, stopping at each door with the same measured knock. Friedrich closed the bakery door carefully. The house had once held ordinary sounds. Chairs scraping across the kitchen floor. Water simmering in a dented pot. The low murmur of neighbors through thin walls. Now it held only breathing. The family sat close together in the front room because the back windows had been shattered weeks earlier by artillery. Blankets were pinned over the broken glass, but the cold still pressed through. The father had moved a heavy wardrobe against the front window as a precaution, leaving only a narrow slit through which the street could be watched. No one was watching now. It was safer not to. The children had been instructed without words. When darkness fell, they lay still. No whispering. No sudden movement. The youngest, a girl of 7, had learned to control the small cough that troubled her in winter. She pressed her face into her sleeve when it came, stifling it until her eyes watered. Her brother, 2 years older, had begun to anticipate sounds before they happened. He tensed at distant boots on cobblestones, at the slam of a door 3 houses away. The adults did not speak of fear. They spoke of practicalities. If someone knocked, the father would answer. If they forced entry, the mother would gather the children and move toward the cellar. Papers had been hidden beneath loose floorboards. A small suitcase sat ready with bread crusts and a tin of dried turnip. These plans had been rehearsed silently, adjusted after each rumor from neighbors. They offered little protection, but repetition gave structure to waiting. They had learned to expect intrusion. Earlier in the war, men in uniform had entered without knocking. Drawers overturned. Mattresses sliced. Questions asked with the certainty that no answer would suffice. Once, a neighbor across the street had been taken away after such a visit. The family had watched from behind curtains as his wife stood barefoot in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, as if bracing against wind that was not there. He did not return. Propaganda had filled the spaces between these memories. The wireless had spoken in steady tones about enemies who would show no mercy. British soldiers were described as calculating, their politeness a cover for humiliation. Pamphlets distributed months before had warned that surrender meant degradation, that families would be separated, that women would not be safe. Even those who had stopped listening could not entirely unlearn what they had heard. Images lingered. Uniforms meant power, and power meant the right to decide who stayed and who disappeared. So when the distant rhythm of boots began to approach along the street, the room tightened. It was a distinct sound against the cold air. Not hurried. Not chaotic. Measured. The father raised his head first. The mother's hand found the youngest child's shoulder and pressed gently, signaling stillness. The boy counted the steps without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. They stopped directly outside. The house seemed smaller, the ceiling lower. The father stood slowly, knees stiff from hours of sitting. He glanced at the wardrobe blocking the window as if it might offer guidance. The boots shifted once on the stone outside. A shadow passed briefly across the thin line of light at the window's edge. They expected shouting. A command barked in a language that had been described as clipped and harsh. The crash of wood splintering. Instead, there was a pause. Long enough that the father wondered if the soldiers had moved on. Long enough that the silence itself became another form of pressure. Then came the knock. It was deliberate, but not loud. 3 measured raps against the door. The sound carried through the hallway with a clarity that made the youngest child flinch. It was not the pounding they had braced for. It did not carry urgency or threat. It waited. The father did not move at first. He had prepared himself for force. This restraint was harder to interpret. The mother's eyes searched his face, not for courage but for instruction. Another knock followed, identical to the first. He crossed the room and lifted the small bar that secured the door. His hand hesitated on the handle. He had been told that hesitation could be interpreted as defiance. He opened it. 2 soldiers stood on the step. British, identifiable by their uniforms and the unfamiliar shape of their helmets. Their faces were young, wind-reddened. One held a rifle angled downward, not raised. The other carried a small satchel slung across his chest. The father kept his hands visible. He did not speak English, and the fragments he had heard over the radio sounded foreign and uncertain. The taller soldier removed one glove slowly and reached into his pocket. The movement made the father's shoulders tighten. Instead of papers demanding identification or orders to evacuate, the soldier produced a folded sheet and extended it. The gesture was careful, as if approaching a nervous animal. The father took it, fingers brushing wool. The paper contained printed German text, slightly uneven, informing residents that the area was now under British control. Curfew hours were listed. Instructions about weapons surrender and medical assistance were included. Medical assistance. The second soldier stepped forward slightly and gestured toward the interior of the house. He pointed to his satchel and then mimed a questioning expression, eyebrows raised. The father did not understand at first. The soldier tried again, this time pressing his palm to his own chest and coughing lightly, then tilting his head toward the house. Behind the father, the small cough came again, involuntary this time. The mother's hand tightened on the child's shoulder. The soldier's eyes shifted past the father's arm toward the sound. He did not step forward. He waited. The father turned his head slowly and looked back at his daughter. Her face was pale in the dimness. For a moment, he considered denying it. They had been warned about tricks, about kindness used to gather information. Yet the soldier had not entered. He had not raised his voice. He had knocked. The father stepped aside just enough to reveal the room behind him. The two soldiers exchanged a brief glance. The one with the satchel spoke quietly to his companion, then gestured again, this time with more clarity. "May we?" The father nodded once. They entered without removing their boots, but they moved carefully around the sparse furniture. The rifle remained angled down. The medic, if that was what he was, knelt near the child and opened his satchel. Inside were bandages, small bottles, instruments wrapped in cloth. He asked a question in English, then seemed to realize it would not be understood. Instead, he pointed gently to the girl's throat. The mother hesitated before allowing him closer. She watched his hands with intensity, as if expecting a sudden change in demeanor. His movements were methodical. He examined the child's throat with a small light, listened to her breathing through a metal instrument. He spoke softly, not to the parents but to the girl herself, in a tone that carried no command. The other soldier remained near the door, eyes scanning the room but not intruding. At one point, he noticed the thin blanket pinned over the broken window. The hallway outside the apartment was unheated, and the cold moved easily through the walls. Inside, the family had learned to recognize the smallest sounds that carried through the stairwell. Boots on stone, a cough, the metallic scrape of equipment brushing against plaster. For weeks, rumors had passed from door to door more quickly than food. The British were advancing. The British were already here. The British would punish collaborators. The British would treat every German home as enemy ground. Each version was certain of itself. Behind the apartment door, a mother stood with her back pressed to the wood, her hand resting on the handle as if contact alone might delay what was coming. Her son sat on the edge of the kitchen chair, his coat still on, though he had been indoors for hours. The youngest child had been told not to cry, not to speak, not to move. Even breathing felt like a decision that could attract attention. When the sound finally came, it was not the crash they had rehearsed in their minds. It was a knock. Measured. Not repeated immediately. Just enough to announce presence. The mother did not move at first. She waited for the follow-up, the shout, the command, the blow of a rifle, but instead there was silence. A long pause. Then a second knock, identical to the first. On the other side of the door, the British soldier stood with his rifle slung but not raised. He had been told the building was clear of organized resistance. Still, training did not erase caution. He understood that fear could produce desperate decisions. He also understood something less formal, something not included in instruction, that the people behind the door had likely been told stories about men like him. He did not speak immediately. He chose not to bark an order in a language they might not understand. He knocked again, slower this time, as if allowing space for thought. Inside, the boy looked at his mother. He had heard speeches on the radio describing the enemy as brutal and vindictive. He had been told that foreign soldiers would storm homes and humiliate families. He had seen posters depicting exaggerated cruelty. The knock did not match those images. That discrepancy unsettled him more than noise would have. The mother finally turned the handle. She opened the door only a few inches. Cold air entered first, then the shape of a uniform. The soldier removed his helmet before she could fully focus on his face. He did not smile. He did not glare. He simply lowered his head slightly, an acknowledgement that required no translation. The corridor light behind him revealed two other soldiers waiting at the stairwell. None had their weapons aimed. None stepped forward without invitation. The mother opened the door wider. There were no dramatic exchanges. The soldier spoke slowly, in careful German learned in training. He asked how many people were inside. He asked whether anyone was wounded. He did not step over the threshold until she moved aside. The apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. A small stove struggled against the cold. The table was set with chipped plates, though there was little on them. The soldier's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the details that suggested ordinary life continuing in reduced form. He saw no weapons, no insignia, only a family standing too still. He explained that the building would be inspected. He explained that curfew would remain in effect. His tone did not rise. It did not soften artificially either. It remained professional, almost administrative. The boy waited for an accusation. He expected to be questioned about his father, who had not returned from the front. He expected suspicion, perhaps anger. Instead, the soldier asked whether the windows were intact and whether they had enough fuel for the stove. The question felt misplaced. Fuel was a concern for winter, not conquest. The mother hesitated before answering. She nodded once. It was not entirely true. The soldier looked toward the youngest child, who had retreated behind the table. For a moment the child's fear appeared almost physical, as if bracing for impact. The soldier did not approach. He simply adjusted the strap of his satchel and turned back to the mother. He removed a small packet from his pocket, biscuits wrapped in paper. He placed them on the table without ceremony. "For the children," he said. Nothing more. The gesture created discomfort rather than relief. The mother stared at the packet as if it were a test. Propaganda had described such offerings as tricks, bait before harsher treatment. She did not reach for it. The boy felt anger rise unexpectedly. It was easier to resent cruelty than to interpret restraint. If the enemy was monstrous, resistance remained simple. If the enemy behaved predictably, hatred required no adjustment. But this moment asked something more complicated. It asked them to observe without immediate condemnation. The soldier completed his inspection quickly. He did not open drawers unnecessarily. He did not disturb personal belongings. He noted the number of occupants in a small notebook and stepped back toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. "If there is illness," he said, searching for the correct words, "there is a medical station at the school building on the corner. You may go there tomorrow." Medical station. The phrase hung in the air. The family had been told that surrender would bring humiliation and deprivation. Yet here was information offered without threat. After the door closed, the apartment felt different, though nothing material had changed. The stove still struggled. The plates remained nearly empty. The father was still absent. But the expected rupture, the violent confirmation of every warning, had not arrived. The mother approached the table slowly and picked up the packet. She turned it over in her hands, examining the unfamiliar print. She did not open it immediately. She placed it beside the stove, as if proximity to heat might reveal something hidden. The boy moved to the window and watched through a narrow gap in the curtain. The British soldiers continued down the hallway, repeating the same measured knock at the next door. No shouting followed. No crashes. Just the pattern of announcement and waiting. Across the courtyard, another apartment door opened. A woman stepped into the corridor with her hands visible. A brief conversation occurred. The soldiers listened more than they spoke. Inside the first apartment, the youngest child finally moved from behind the table and approached the biscuits. Hunger competed with suspicion. The mother watched carefully, then nodded once. The paper was opened. The smell was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. The child took a small bite and waited, as if expecting reprimand from the air itself. None came. The boy felt something shift inside him that he could not name. It was not gratitude. It was not trust. It was the weakening of a certainty he had relied on. He had been prepared to endure cruelty. He had rehearsed defiance in silence. Instead he was confronted with ordinary conduct. That ordinariness unsettled him more deeply than hostility might have. The story did not travel as an announcement. It moved in fragments, carried in low voices between doorways and along the narrow path that ran beside the well. A woman mentioned it while exchanging potatoes for salt. A boy repeated what he had heard to his older sister as they gathered kindling. A wounded railway worker, home from the front with a bandaged shoulder and a limp, listened without interrupting. The account changed slightly each time it was told, but one detail remained fixed. The British soldier had knocked before entering. For weeks, the village had lived in anticipation of something harsher. They had been instructed for years on what to expect. The enemy would humiliate them. The enemy would plunder. The enemy would punish without distinction between soldier and child. Posters and radio speeches had described it with certainty. Mothers had memorized warnings. Children had absorbed them without context. Even as the front collapsed and columns of German troops retreated through the countryside, the message remained intact. Surrender would not bring mercy. So when the first British patrol appeared on the road beyond the orchard, boots steady, rifles slung but not raised, the village retreated indoors. Curtains were drawn. Lamps extinguished early. In cellars that smelled of damp earth and stored cabbage, families waited for the inevitable banging on doors. It came as a knock. Not the splintering crash they had rehearsed in their minds, but 3 measured taps against wood. Inside one of the smaller houses, a widow stood rigid beside the kitchen table. Her son, 12 years old, clutched the back of her skirt. They had heard the stories of eastern territories, of entire streets emptied overnight. They expected shouting in a language they did not understand. Instead, when she opened the door a few inches, a British soldier stood there, hat slightly askew from the rain. He spoke slowly, his accent unfamiliar but his tone even. He gestured toward the barn behind her house and then to his unit further down the road. He asked, in halting German learned from a phrasebook, whether they could shelter briefly from the weather. He did not step forward. She did not answer at first. The boy watched the man's boots. They were muddy, but not planted aggressively. The rifle remained pointed toward the ground. The soldier waited. Finally, she nodded once and opened the door wider. He removed his helmet before entering the yard. It was not a grand exchange. There was no handshake. The barn was cold and smelled of livestock. The soldiers stacked their packs carefully along one wall and kept to themselves. One of them asked for water. Another handed the boy a small square of chocolate from a ration tin. The boy did not eat it immediately. He held it as if it might be taken back. By morning, the patrol moved on. The widow swept the barn floor as she always did. The day resumed its usual tasks, hauling water, mending clothing, measuring out flour. But something had shifted in the quiet calculations people made about what might happen next. When the account reached the railway worker, he dismissed it at first. He had seen too much on the front to believe in courtesy. He had watched men reduced to numbers in reports, villages reduced to coordinates. War did not allow for gentleness. Yet when a British medic later examined his shoulder in the square, cleaning the wound without comment, replacing the dressing with fresh gauze, he felt the same disorientation described by the widow. The medic's hands were firm and efficient. He asked simple questions about pain and fever. He did not inquire about the man's past service. He did not demand apologies. When the worker attempted to explain, awkwardly, that he had been called up, that he had not volunteered, the medic only nodded and continued his task. The exchange lasted less than 10 minutes. It left the worker unsettled. In the following days, doors opened a fraction sooner when boots approached. Not wide, not welcoming, but no longer bolted at the first sound. Women stepped outside to hang laundry even when British trucks passed. Children observed from corners rather than hiding under beds. The fear had not disappeared. It remained present, layered over years of instruction and repetition. But it no longer felt absolute. There were still searches. Houses were inspected for weapons. A former party official was taken away under guard. No one mistook the occupation for friendship. The soldiers enforced curfews. They posted notices. They carried authority with them in every movement. Yet the absence of shouting, the lack of arbitrary violence, created confusion more than relief. At night, in kitchens lit by a single candle, families spoke more openly than they had in months. The language shifted from certainty to uncertainty. Perhaps they are not as we were told, someone would say, careful not to speak too loudly. Another would respond, it is only the beginning. We cannot know. The propaganda did not collapse in a single moment. It thinned at the edges. For the children, the recalibration was visible in small gestures. A girl who had once hidden her doll when foreign soldiers passed now left it on the windowsill. A boy dared to ask a British guard about the insignia on his sleeve. The guard answered briefly and returned to his post. The exchange was ordinary, almost dull, yet it contradicted years of instruction that contact would bring humiliation. The soldier who had knocked on the widow's door carried the memory with him as the unit advanced to the next district. He did not speak about it often. Among his comrades, conversation focused on rations, routes, the condition of roads. But during long marches, when rain soaked through his uniform and the weight of his pack pressed into his shoulders, he recalled the hesitation in the woman's eyes and the boy's rigid stance. He had been told, before crossing into German territory, to expect hostility or submission. He had prepared for resistance. The silence he encountered instead, dense, watchful, frightened, had required a different discipline. It was easier, in some ways, to respond to aggression than to fear. Fear demanded restraint. He thought about the knock more than he expected. It had not been planned. It was simply how he would have approached any door at home. Yet in that context, it had become an action with consequence. He did not consider it kindness. He considered it procedure. Still, he understood that for those inside, it might have signified something else. War measured progress in maps and reports. Units moved forward. Lines shifted. But none of those documents recorded the slight reduction in hesitation when a door opened, or the way a child's posture changed from rigid to cautious curiosity. Those details remained outside official language. Back in the village, the widow kept the empty chocolate wrapper in a drawer with ration coupons and old photographs. She did not display it. She did not speak of it often. But when neighbors repeated darker rumors from other regions, she would add quietly, "Here, it was different." She did not claim safety. She did not claim trust. Only difference. For years afterward, the family would return to that night not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had happened in the way they had been told it would. The mother remembered the cold first. It had settled into the walls long before darkness fell, a damp winter cold that crept through cracks in the frame of the door and under the thin blankets wrapped around her children. Coal had run low weeks earlier. Windows were patched with cardboard. The war had already taken most of what could be taken. What remained was waiting. They had been told what to expect. The radio broadcasts before the town fell silent had been clear enough. The enemy would come angry. They would come humiliated and vengeful. They would punish civilians for crimes real or imagined. The mother had listened with her hands pressed flat against the kitchen table, nodding at each warning as though preparation could soften what was promised. Her husband had been gone 2 years by then, first to the Eastern Front, then into a silence that meant either captivity or a grave no one would mark. So when the British units moved into the district, the family closed the shutters and extinguished the lamp. The children were instructed not to speak. The youngest boy was told that if soldiers came, he must not cry. He practiced biting his sleeve to muffle the sound. Fear became a routine that evening. It was managed the way hunger had been managed, by rationing hope and expecting the worst. Outside, boots passed at intervals. They could not see who wore them, only hear the scrape against the frozen street. Each set of footsteps tightened the air in the room. The mother counted them without meaning to. One group passed. Then another. Laughter drifted once, low and unfamiliar. It did not sound like the rage she had been promised. That unsettled her more than shouting might have. Across town, a young British soldier moved with his section under orders to check houses along the narrow street. He had been briefed on caution. There were reports of hidden weapons, of desperate resistance from civilians who had been fed a steady diet of warnings about occupation. He had also been told, quietly, by a sergeant older than the rest, to keep his voice steady and his rifle lowered unless there was reason not to. The war had ended for this town, the sergeant had said. It did not need to begin again inside a kitchen. The soldier had not imagined himself standing in front of civilian doors when he enlisted. He had pictured open fields and clear objectives. This was different. Each doorway was a question. He thought of his own mother's house back in Manchester, the narrow hallway, the smell of boiled potatoes on a cold evening. He did not consider himself compassionate. He considered himself tired. When he reached the family's door, he paused. Light did not leak through the cracks. The house looked empty. He could have moved on. Instead, he raised his hand and knocked. Inside, the sound landed like a blow. Not a pounding. Not the violent crash they had rehearsed in their imaginations. A measured knock, twice, then silence. The mother's first instinct was disbelief. Revenge, she had been told, would not announce itself politely. She motioned for the children to stay back and stepped toward the door. Her hands trembled, though she held them tightly together to disguise it. Another knock followed, softer. A voice came through the wood, speaking German slowly, heavily accented. The words were simple: open the door. No shouting. No threats. Just instruction. She unlatched it. The soldier stood there, helmet slightly askew, boots coated with road salt. His rifle hung at his side, not raised. He looked younger than she had expected. His face was drawn as though sleep had been scarce. He did not step forward immediately. He waited for her to meet his eyes. The children stared from behind her skirt. They had been prepared for something monstrous. The man at the door looked cold. He asked how many people were inside. She answered truthfully. He asked whether any soldiers were hiding there. She shook her head. He did not push past her to search. Instead, he leaned slightly to glance into the dim hallway and then nodded, as though satisfied by what little he could see. The silence stretched. It was not comfortable. It felt unstable, like ice that might crack under the wrong movement. He reached into his coat pocket. The mother stiffened. The children retreated another step. From the pocket, he withdrew not a weapon but a small wrapped parcel. He hesitated again, as though uncertain whether this act might be misread. Then he extended it toward her. Biscuits. Compressed, military rations. Plain and dry. She did not take them at first. Suspicion was stronger than hunger. The propaganda had been thorough. It had described tricks, cruelty disguised as charity. The soldier seemed to understand her hesitation. He placed the parcel on the narrow shelf just inside the doorframe instead of pressing it into her hands. For the children, he said, still in careful German. The boy who had practiced biting his sleeve stared at the food without moving. The mother gave a short nod but did not speak. Gratitude felt dangerous, as though it might be interpreted as betrayal of something larger and invisible. The soldier shifted his weight. He explained, briefly, that they were checking houses to ensure no fighting continued. He asked whether they needed medical help. The question felt almost inappropriate in its gentleness. Need had become too ordinary to discuss. No, she replied. He seemed relieved. Not triumphant. Relieved. For a moment, neither of them knew how to conclude the exchange. The rules they had been given did not account for this version of events. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway. He did not salute. He did not offer reassurance. He simply said they would pass through again the next day and that they should remain inside after dark. Then he turned and walked away, boots scraping against the frozen ground just as others had before him. The mother closed the door carefully, as though sudden movement might reverse what had just occurred.